Thanks.
Okay. Welcome everyone for the workshop on GML. As you can see, I'm not Christina Giga, who unfortunately cannot be here because she's ill. Some weeks ago we had a meeting in Paris working on some GML related issues in a group of experts, and we decided that we'll basically throw together a few outcomes of the workshops and have a lot of discussions on one of the proposals that we started discussing at the workshop. So basically there will be only two parts. One will be a short summary of the workshop, and basically what I did is I took a number of slides from each of the presenters of the workshops and threw them together in a presentation. So I'll try to go through them, or if you prefer, I can ask the people present in the audience to present their own slides. And then just basically give some summaries of what we discussed at the workshop. And then the second part, we discussed about the update of the Annex 1 schemas, and I made a proposal based on the discussion of the workshop for updating the Annex 1 schemas, and I would like to share them with you and have some discussion on whether that's the right way forward or not. So just to give you a bit of context, we have in the draft work program of the maintenance and implementation for Inspire, we have three issues included that are related to GML, and that's why at the end of May we had a workshop, as I said, in Paris with a number of people that are also here today, to more clearly define what we should actually do related to GML in the maintenance and implementation work, and to plan how to proceed and what should be the next steps. The format of the workshop was to have a number of introductory presentations, and that's where I stole some of the slides. And then basically have discussion about different issues. And if you're interested in all the details of all the slides, you can go to the MIG collaboration space and download them there. So the first presentation that I stole from was from Peter, who presented about some experience made in the UK, I think largely from a OGC Plugfest, on trying to see what different softwares can do with GML. And the conclusions you can see here, there were a number of problems with multiplicity greater 1. Most of the software doesn't actually use the XML schemas when reading GML files. There were problems with GML wrapper for grid data, and so on. So you see a number of problems here, and you will see with the other slides that these are actually recurring issues. I will not go through all the details of the slides because that would probably take too much time.
I was working on Friday morning.
There you go.
In the apps and applications section for some reason. Which is 4 short talks.
Okay, good. We had a presentation from IGN France also, who did a similar kind of test from Marie, who did a number of tests as well to see what an average user can do with Inspire data. And you have a number of themes, and you have the different kind of complexity categories that the theme actually uses in this table. And then they did a bit of tests with different kinds of software that they didn't want to put here for confidentiality reasons, but you can see there's a lot of red here. So most of the software products tested couldn't deal with hardly any of the things that were thrown at them. So we have another presentation that clearly showed that there is a big gap between what is present in the Inspire data model or the schemas and what existing GIS software tools can handle. Yeah, one of the reasons I think why it's been anonymized is because you didn't kind of done a proper test.
Yes, we didn't make that by an average user, so maybe some functionalities are available, but not for
an average user. Okay. A third presentation was again from France, from Sylvain from BRGM. It's also here. Yeah. Again, there was the notion that even though there's been many years of experience, at least in BRGM, with working on complex schemas, again, there are a number of software tools that are not really using the schemas, or that they are embedded in the source code as well. There are some solutions out there that can handle complex schemas like those used in Inspire, but the conclusions that Sylvain had, and that we also came to at the workshop, is basically we should work on two aspects. First of all, to help enhance the implementations, work with the vendors of this, or the software developers, to improve the software so that they can handle more of the complex schemas, but also to lower the implementation barrier in Inspire. On his wish list, there were a number of things. One was to have a kind of compatibility matrix to see what kind of software basically supports what kind of features or what kind of characteristics or aspects of the schemas, but also to have some kind of cookbooks to help people with the implementation. And one of the proposed simplifications potentially for the schemas was to have some kind of simplified schemas, for example, like the portrayal classes that we have in GeoSciML as well. We had a presentation from Switzerland raising a number of issues as well. One of them was on the documentation. It's very difficult for implementers to find what they need to look for in all the thousands of pages of Inspire technical guidelines. But also the information is spread between different systems and artifacts in the Inspire infrastructure. There was also a common theme across the different tests and different presentations, that the references to external code, well, to code lists managed in the Inspire registry usually was not often used by the client tools that were reading the files, so you didn't actually see the name or the label of the code list values that were used in the data. There were a number of comments around constraints. We have a number of constraints in the UML data models that are not readily or they cannot be reflected in the XML schemas. For example, where constraints describe a choice between two geometry types. This is not reflected in the XML schema. Okay. Again, there were a number of comments on the links between classes as well, and I think the ultimate conclusion was: do we need to define a more simple profile of GML that we could base simplified schemas on? That would make it easier for implementer software developers to know what subset of GML an XML schema they would need to produce, to support. Sorry. There was again a test done in the Netherlands by GNovum, where they were looking at another, not an Inspire complex schema, but a similar one based on CTGML, and they looked at different schema, different versions, or different complex, differently complex versions of the schema based on simple features and on KML. And they tested a number of software products, similarly to what was done in the UK and in France as well. And again, we see an anonymized table here to see what kind of support was there for the different kinds of profiles. And you can see that there's still a lot of red there, where the more simple profiles on the right were slightly better supported than the other ones. In conclusion, support for GML 3.2 was not well supported. Much better 3.1.1. And when we discussed in the workshop, 2.1 would have been even probably much better supported. There was an idea to implement a kind of another test case where you do a relay of giving a file to one software, having it read it, having it write it back, and then passing it on to the next software to see what happens with that file through the different software products. From Clemens Portele, we had 4 recommendations. One was to consider additional simplified encoding schemas based on, for example, simple features, or it could be also applying to other encodings as well. For the schema lifecycle, and we'll come to that later, is we need to consider what happens when we change a schema, who is impacted by that, and not only think about the data providers that have already used an old schema, but we should also think about the people who have built client applications or transformation tools that are dependent on different or on the schemas as well, and where a change in the schema can have quite a big impact as well. And therefore, the recommendation was to include software implementers early in the process, and not only once a new version is published, to announce that discussion and to understand what would be the impact. I hope I gave justice to most of the presentations. I don't know if the speakers want to add something, or what I have run over too quickly. No. Okay. As a summary, as recurring topics from the presentations, there were a number of suggestions for having additional simplified schemas. For example, based on GML simple features level 0, or even simpler profiles. To do an analysis of what aspects of GML or XML schema are actually being used in the Inspire models. We need to discuss about the maintenance procedures of the Inspire schemas, and that includes communication aspects as well. There were a number of comments on the implementation of the UML to GML encoding rules, including the usage of, or the translation of constraints in the UML models. Could they be mapped, or how they should be mapped to schematron rules? I also already mentioned documentation and capacity building. We still get a lot of questions and around where to find the right documentation, and it's too much widespread across the Inspire infrastructure. And then finally, we have this gap between the complex Inspire schemas and what current tools can support, and particularly what client tools can support. And the two possible solutions that were outlined were basically to reduce the complexity of the schema, so that's the point 1 up there, but also to encourage better support by vendors. And that could, for example, be helped by doing this analysis of which aspects are actually being used in the Inspire model, so point 2. On the gap between the complex schemas and the current tool support, we basically came up with the following proposal, that we have these 2 points, less complex schemas but a better support by vendors. For the first point, we wanted to work on creating a repository of possible rules that you can use for simplifying the schemas. So basically a number of rules. This is say you could simplify the schema by doing this and that. For example, by limiting the multiplicity of a property to maximum 1, rather than having multiple values for a property, and other possible simplifications as well. Other examples would be just having 1 geometry property per feature. We said we will not work on, or it's unrealistic to work on an automatic simplification of the schemas. So basically it would then be up to the thematic communities to look at this set of simplification rules and to decide which of those actually makes sense for a specific theme, and also first to decide whether they think they need or they would like to have an additional simplified schema for their theme, but then to decide which of those simplification rules to apply. We said that some of the recommendations could be overarching, so there could be some rules that there's a recommendation that, if possible, all of the themes should, if they define additional simplified schemas, should be using that rule. And then once a simplified schema is being developed, it would go through the normal process of the MIG maintenance. Let's say it would be proposed to be added as an additional encoding to the technical guidelines after it's been tested and documented sufficiently. The other point is a bit less clearly defined. One of the things we said we should work with the vendors to be able to support more complex models. And one of the steps towards that would be to understand better what are the aspects, as I said, which subsets of GML and XML schema are actually being used in the Inspire schema. So basically, you saw a table before that basically did this analysis by theme. If we did that for all the schemas, I think it would be a useful first step. But also, it would be important to work with users to better understand what they can get out of the complex models. So we said probably there is not enough push from the data providers and the users towards the vendors to improve or to improve the support for the complex schemas. So if let's say there is a wide call from the community to say we need these complex schemas because they are good value, because we can do these and these things with it, potentially vendors may be willing to add the support or put it higher up in the list of their things to be implemented. We had then a discussion on the rules for schema maintenance. Let's say the starting point for this discussion mainly was that we have a number of changes to the data models of the Annex 1 themes in the recent amendment of the implementing rules for data interoperability. that basically require us to update the Annex 1 schemas as well. And the proposal for these updates of the schemas that we proposed at the end of last year basically started a discussion on what should be the process of updating schemas, who should be involved, how do we test, endorse, and so on, new schemas. And the main conclusion that we took during the meeting was basically that we should have as a main goal for this work that existing data and software that were created according to the old schemas should still work with the new schemas as well. And I'll come to that when we go through the detailed proposals for the Annex 1 updates. We discussed that it's equally important to define how to communicate about the changes, because that, I think, most of the discussion we had around the Annex 1 updates were not so much about the details of the proposal, but more about how to communicate to the wider stakeholder community that there is a need for an update, how the update has been done, what are the timelines for users and for data providers, software developers to adopt the new schemas, how they have been tested, and so on. And then finally, we had a discussion around the question that if we do an update in the schemas, we should also be reflecting that update in the UML models explicitly. So rather than deleting a class, for example, in the UML model because it's been removed in the legal act, we should mark it as deprecated in the same way as we mark it deprecated in the XML schema. So there was some agreement that we should have a one-to-one mapping between the UML model and the schemas, even if we do deprecation and updates of models and schemas, so that we will be always able to generate automatically the schemas from the models. But there would be still some work to be done, or some agreement on how to do these things in UML, because it's not straightforward. We didn't discuss this a lot, but we basically agreed in the workshop that we should develop a work plan in more detail, distinguishing between a number of short-term actions, but longer-term actions around updating and endorsement of the schemas, and then maybe also have some parallel activities around the development of simplified guidelines and schemas. So the work plan again should also then detail on how these things could be achieved. Should we set up a mixed subgroup? Do we need to have separate contracts? Can there be projects? And we listed a number of potential funding or support through projects and that we could think of. But as I said, this was not really deeply discussed, but it's clear that we need to basically put the ideas and the discussions that we had at the workshop into a more detailed work plan for the GML related activities. That was a very quick overview of the workshop. I don't know if anybody has any questions, or if any of the participants that were there in Paris have anything to add to what I forgot. Questions? Okay. Fine with me. Come to the more interesting part. We had some discussions on how we should update the Annex 1 XML schemas, and this is where I really would like you to participate in the discussion and tell me what you think about the different proposals that we have come up with. So to give you again some context, we have had an amendment of the regulation on interoperability of spatial data sets and services. So that's the data specification legal act, let's say, last October, I think, yeah. And okay, the main part of that regulation, of course, was about the Annex 2 and 3 data models. But for consistency between Annex 2 and 3 and Annex 1, we also had to change a few things in the Annex 1 data models. Because during the Annex 1 process, we had a number of classes in the models that we called candidate types and placeholders. For example, there was a relationship between addresses and buildings. So if you have an address, it had a relationship to a building class. And that was already defined in Annex 1. But because building is in Annex 3, we couldn't define it during the Annex 1 process. So we basically created what we called, I think, a candidate type in that case. So there was a type in the provisional type in the UML data model, which was then subsequently updated by the Annex 2 and 3 themes, thematic working groups 3 years later. So in order to bring these updates back into the Annex 1 data models, we needed to update the Annex 1 data models. Just to say, the difference between candidate types and placeholders was that candidate types were in the legal act and placeholders weren't. So the changes that we did were first to remove a number of candidate types and placeholders and references to them because they either didn't fit, well, they didn't fit in the conceptual understanding, let's say, of the theme that the Annex 2 and 3 groups had. One of the examples is that the administrative units had a link to a nuts unit, and that was a candidate type for the statistical units theme. And the statistical units theme decided that nuts was not a class, but it was an instance of a data set. So they defined the concept at a more generic level. So it was proposed to remove that from the administrative unit model. The second point is that we have kind of superseded some of the candidate types and placeholders with new classes. So that was basically the planned way in which we should have proceeded with the candidate types and placeholders. And the relationship between the address and the building is a good example because the building type has been replaced by something that's called abstract construction. So it's more generic. We have also moved some of the types into a different package, but the types have basically stayed the same. We have created some additional subtypes of an Annex 1 type. So we had an abstract hydro object in Annex 1, and we have created some subtypes of that in one of the Annex 3 themes, C regions. There's a new complete data model for maritime units and administrative units. That is actually not a problem because for that we've just created a new schema and that's it. And the last point was that we've changed one geometry type of an existing Annex 1 type from surface to multi-surface. So these were basically the changes that we did in the Annex 1 models, and these require now the Annex 1 schemas to be updated as well. The last thing that also has changed between Annex 1 and Annex 2 and 3 is the encoding rule for code lists. In the old version of the encoding rule, the code lists were mapped to a GML code type. In the new version, it is basically a GML reference type because we have decided to no longer manage the code list values in the UML data model, but to manage them externally in the Inspire registry. So the overall approach for updating the schemas was, as I said, to make sure that existing data and software that we're creating according to the old schemas should remain valid, should remain valid. And for that reason, we are proposing to not change the namespace of the new schemas for the new minor revision of the schema. So if you go from version 3.0 to 3.1, we propose to keep the version part of the namespace at 3.0. This is not according to the schema maintenance rules that we have defined during the Annex 1 process that have been inspired by the OGC schema maintenance process. But otherwise, we cannot meet, well, it will be difficult to meet the goal pointed in the first bullet point. The other thing we said we should do is to include only changes that relax the schema. So we shouldn't have schemas that are more restrictive, because again, that would invalidate, it could invalidate data that has been created to the old schemas. When writing this down, I realized that this may still create problems for existing software, because if they are expecting data based on the old schema, they may get data that is more relaxed than what the old schemas allowed. So there may be a problem there. So basically, I think in conclusion, it will be difficult to come up with one schema that both doesn't break existing data implementations and existing software. But we need to see. The last overall principle was we keep any elements that have been deleted or deprecated in the schemas, but we annotate them as being deprecated, rather than just removing them. Okay, what does that mean in practice? So if we're looking at deprecation or supersession of types, we will keep the schemas that we had created in Annex 1 for the candidate types and placeholders. For example, the building type that was created in Annex 1 lives in a building schema version 0.0 in the Inspire schema repository. Even though this has now been replaced by a new type in the Annex 2 and 3, we will keep the old building schema there in order to allow old data, or data that has been created according to the old schema that is still valid. Where we have elements that point to these old types, we will deprecate these elements. Where we have as kind of a supersession, we will update the element in the reference that is done through an app info annotation, and we will update that to the new types. There is an open question still on how do we update schemas of common supertypes. We'll come to that at the end. And for the last point is we've moved some types from one package to another one, and we would consider those to be a deprecation of the type in the package A, and we will be adding the same type in the package B, and we will then update the references. So basically, the move would be implemented through a combination of a deprecation and an addition. For the deprecation of elements, we had some discussions already last year on how that could be done. One proposal was to just use a deprecated keyword in the annotation here. When making the slide, I thought maybe we want to include some additional information. So then another option could be we actually define an element, a Boolean element, for example, that has some additional attributes in it, telling us what was the version in which the document, the element was deprecated, or the date since it was deprecated. we could even include some more legal information saying you're not legally allowed to use this element anymore from 2015 for newly created data and from 2020 for any other data. So this is just an idea that I had the other day to try and to see if we want to have additional information about the deprecation in the schema document. Any initial thoughts, ideas, opinions on this?
What is the legal solution for that? What is the obligation for producers to apply the new schema? Is it the same as those of Annex 2 and 3?
Well, there's no legal obligation to use the schemas anyway, because the schemas are part of the technical guidelines, so they're not part.
The data structure, what is,
The legal
exactly what are the legal obligations because of the change?
The timeline for the change is the same as for the Annex 2 and 3. So let's say you have an Annex 1 administrative unit data set, and you've already implemented that according to the old schemas. Now there's a change on the nuts element, for example, and you want to remove that from the data set. I think you would have to the 21st of October 2015 if it was a newly created data set, or until 2020 if it was an existing data set, to make that change. Yeah, but I mean that is a part of the things that we discussed about communication. It will, when a new schema is published, it should be very clear, not only somewhere hidden in a annotation element, but in the accompanying message or documentation of when people will have to move from the old schema to the new one. But again, I mean, there's no legal obligation to use the schema in any case, but we should be clear. Yeah.
One of our biggest concerns is not incrementing the namespace. So then we don't know which schemas to use to read the data. Now your suggestion is that if it's only loosening a constraint, that somehow everything should still be readable. But I still see that we could run into problems there without knowing ultimately which schema to use.
You mean when you get a data set, yeah, the data set will have to say which schema it uses?
Yeah, but if the namespace doesn't change, then there's no way really to know, because the namespace should be directly mapped to a certain schema version. Otherwise, it's very difficult to automatically.
I think you mentioned that on the slide. You said we're going to break the connection between namespace and
yes.
SD.
But I think it's essentially, let's say in your case, I would always read the latest version of the schema because you're losing it. That should work in all cases, right? I think
that's the constraint.
That's basically the constraint. There is also, let's say, if you have some data and you want to know which version that was created from, then you have to follow the link to the schema that this file points to.
Yes.
And that should, in the version attribute of that schema document, you should be able to identify which subversion that is. I mean, it's no different in for bug fixes in OGC. It's the same thing, for example. And if there is a bug in one schema, you don't change the namespace. You have to look at the subversion of the version attribute.
So there's a version within the namespace declaration is a version?
No. The schema document has a version attribute. That's actually also what W3C uses to some extent. So I think it's and that's basically the change that is here also compared to what OGC does. Not to just use it for bug fixes where something's really broken, but to also use that for minor updates to keep existing data and existing implementations on the server side more happy. Michael, you mentioned that there is of course still the issue if you have something that's based on a client, a consumer, that is based on an old version,
Yes.
and it might get newer things which it's not prepared for. But in the discussion that we had in Paris, we said it's, at least at the moment, as I said, there is no golden
Silver bullet, yeah.
silver bullet. And at the moment, there is far more investment on software on the server side than on the consumer side. So it was felt like that this is probably lesser
evil. Yeah.
That is existing.
That was the logic behind it.
Yeah. And that's why it's also important to have advanced notice, have good communication, so that, because particularly when you're on the consumer side, you should update, and it's on the server side, on the provider side, you can also switch for some time to an older version because it still works. But if you write software on the consumer side, then you really have to be more more up to date and catch up, right? So software that reads it. That's why advanced notice is important, because there is some lead times with new product versions, etc. Right? So I think that's the discussions that we have there, and why that is essential for guys like you.
But there's nothing in the GML data itself. You mentioned the schema document. There's nothing in the data itself to where a subversion information could be stored, because it's all you've got is the namespace declaration, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, you have to.
And implicitly, you have the link to the schema document that you point to, and there you can look at but most software isn't reading the schema anyhow, right? But there you can look at the version attribute of the schema document, and then you can see whether it's the 2014 version of the schema or the 2016 version, or however the versioning is done there.
Yeah, then you just need to version the actual schema files, the schema locations properly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the idea would still be to have the schema files versioned according to the different versions,
Right.
but just to keep the namespace in the, yeah.
Correct. I mean, it's like you have the latest version, right, that your standard URL points to, but you also have the old ones. I mean, that's no different than in OGC, where you also have all the subversions of GML 2.1.2. There's 6 or 7 by now. You can get them. I mean, most people will never notice that they are there, but if you want them, you can find them.
But the basic constraint is that any changes made to the schema documents must be able to read old data. That's essentially full compliant.
Correct.
Yes, exactly.
With the same namespace version.
Yes, if you're still in the same namespace version. I mean, basically the discussion was if you break backwards compatibility for reading, you go to a new major release revision. No? This is basically what it could look like in the schema. We're talking about deprecation. This is again the example of the nuts property of the administrative units. So one thing we would have is we'll change the minimum multiplicity from 1 here, was implicitly 1, to 0 here, to basically making it optional. So on the left-hand side you see the old schema, on the right hand the proposed new one. So on the left one you would always have to provide this element, whereas on the right-hand side you could just leave it out, and then basically have some kind of information about the deprecation in the annotation, and that could be included in the text as well, so that it becomes more easily readable by standard tools. But it could be included with a number of metadata as written before in a specific element here as well. For the update of the references, this is an example for the address that I mentioned. The building property in the old schema or the old data model, it pointed to this candidate type called building in a building schema, and that was updated in Annex 2 and 3 to point to building base abstract construction. Now the actual schema stays the same, because basically what we have is we have an element called building of type GML reference type in both cases. What changes, or what should change, is again the annotation here, where we have the target element here that points to the building here, and it would point to the BU-based construction, abstract construction in the new schema. Now my question is, okay, from a schema point of view, yes, it is the same schema, but is it still backwards compatible? Are any tools using the target schema element? Are validators using that? Question mark? Is this something that is being used? And then if it is, if we change it, it is no longer backwards compatible. And the question would be, if it is no longer backwards compatible, we would need to express a kind of a choice here. So saying either the target should be either a BUI building or a BU-based abstract construction. But yeah.
I have one remark actually. For all these changes, it would be good to make these changes soon, because the longer we will do this, the more people will have to implement it.
Sure.
So but again, you're proposing this be done in the same namespace version.
This change, yes. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I think you probably are using it, so it would probably break an existing workspace that was based on the old schema.
So you're saying that you're actually using the target element information from the schema?
I'll have to go. I'll check.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that you're using it at all. Because the actual value that goes into the GML reference type is essentially the URI, so the identifier of the feature that's being referenced.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite a difficult thing to validate back against that. I know that all the tools I've used, they don't use it at all, the target element. So, from my experience, that would remain backwards compatible right now, but how vendors want to use it in the future.
So it really is just an annotation, just saying, okay, it's a URI basically you put in here, but the target of that should be an abstract construction or a building.
But the namespace itself changes from BU-L to BU-base. No? Or that's just...
That's the namespace of the object that you get when resolving the URI.
So I think we do, most of the time we don't use the target element. I think there have been cases where we have used it. Although I would have the tendency to actually make it correct, because with the statement that also the old version where you have data where you use BUI building, it would still validate. And strictly, if you read the normative text of GML, the right-hand side wouldn't fit that. So I would rather either insert a second target element.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's, you have to go back to the text to read it, or make it GML abstract feature.
Ah, okay.
Okay, that's right. So even further. The two things defined in two separate schemas. So one's in this building schema version 0.0, and the other one in the version 3.0 schema.
This is the 0.0 building thing, and this is the 3.0 building space. It's two different schemas, and the elements that you see would be in two different address versions of the address schema as well. Yes.
So is the namespace actually also different? We are only seeing the prefix there.
Yeah.
They are different.
The namespace for what?
For the building,
This one?
yeah, and the base.
Yeah, they're different. Sorry. Yes. Yes.
I think in this case, the only way to do it would be to somehow express the choice.
Yes.
In the reference, it's either this one or this one.
Well, I mean, in order to go to the higher level class. Okay. This is something to be further investigated. Coming to the namespaces, in the schemas we are defining the namespace and we're importing the schemas that are used in the target elements. And I was wondering, is that strictly necessary, or would it be enough just to I mean, do we still need to define the namespaces? I guess yes. But do we need to import the schemas? I'm not sure. But that's a more general question on the way and how the XML schemas are generated in any case. So in the first case, we are basically defining the BUI namespace here, and we are importing this schema element, schema document, and we wouldn't need to add the BU base namespace there and to add the import there. And I was wondering whether we actually need to do the schema imports as well, if the element are only used in the target, or if the schemas are only used in the target element.
Well, strictly you have to, but I mean, if that's considered a problem, then I would rather drop the target elements at all, and then you can also drop the import.
Oh, okay.
I mean, otherwise it's like you can't interpret what is in there. It's like when you have a WFS and you use a feature class name in a query, no validator will. I mean, it will never show up in an XML element, the namespace, but you use the qualified name in your XPath expressions in there.
Mm-hmm.
You need to define that as well, because otherwise software processing that can never determine which building it is.
Okay, that's for the definition of the namespace, basically. But do you need to do the import as well? Because that potentially...
But aren't the imports for all the elements that are defined in a parent document?
No, the imports are defined for all the types that are used in the target element annotation here. So in this case, we have a target element BU base. There is no other element in the schema on the right hand side that uses a BU base schema other than the target element here, and it's only used, and only used in the text here. So that's why I was wondering why or whether we need to have the imports there.
Resolve that if you're trying to evaluate that schema. If you don't have that.
Right. If you include the target elements, you need the imports. If you say the
Sure.
target elements are for creating more problems than that they are used, then I would drop the target elements, and you don't need the imports.
But then how does that fit with your compatibility?
No, I mean it's more. There was more on the side actually that I noticed when adding the changes that would need to be done. I would just simply add the new namespaces, and we'll keep the old ones there, and then we just need to find a way in how to implement the choice here, basically. Right? Okay. For moving types, that was actually a bit simpler than I thought it would be. So basically, the example was for example, is wetlands that was defined in the land cover schema in Annex 1, and it was now decided it should go into the hydrography theme in Annex 2 and 3. So the proposal would be that we keep the schema that you see here in that namespace unchanged, and we add a new type called wetland that is the same as the other one, the old one, in the hydrography schema here in version 3.1. And because there are no references to these types, we don't need to change anything else. So basically, if you want to keep your old data as it is, you can just leave it as it is. If you just change the namespace from A to B, you can then be automatically compliant with the new schema as well. Because I mean, there were no changes to the type, so the type basically just moved from one namespace into another one. Then we have the example of the change of a property type. That was the example where we changed the type of the geometry from GM surface to GM multi-surface. It is not a problem because we're at the same time moving the short type from one package to another one. So basically what we would propose to do is just to basically add the new type in the new location in the hydrography package that then has the new multi-surface, GM multi-surface type, and we keep the old one as it is in the old schema. And that would be the only example where you cannot just simply change the namespace to make your data compliant. Unless if you want to allow this updating the schema by simply changing the namespace, we would have to implement a kind of a choice between using a geometry and a multi-surface and a surface property. Correct. Yes. So you basically add a choice to use either the old one or the new type as well. The most complex change, I think, is the additional subtype of the hydro object that has been defined in Annex 2 and 3, because the way in which the schema has been translated, or the UML data model for hydro object has been translated into a schema, is that it lists all the subtypes of the hydro object in the schema. And Clemens explained to me why that is, and I forgot. And maybe you can do it again. The hydro object has a number of subclasses in the Annex 1, and we have a new one in C regions in Annex 3 now as well. And for some reason, when translating the hydro object from UML to XML schema, we have listed all the allowed subclasses in the hydro object property type. And that would mean that we would have to list all the deprecated and new elements in the subtype as well.
Well, the reason for that approach is that XML schema doesn't support multiple inheritance,
yeah.
And hydro object is a mix-in class. So it's not the root class for all the hydro objects really, but it gets mixed in other. So that's basically a separate thing, and that's the way, or one way in which you can mimic this kind of substitutability. So you say whenever you have a hydro object, you have the choice then between the direct subtypes.
Okay.
That's why we have to come up with that mechanism.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, the thing is that there is no reference to a hydro object anywhere in the Inspire model. So basically, this.
That's for in hydro object. There's the relationship hydro object
To.
Related to relationship. So.
To another hydro object.
Every one of these objects can be related to every
Other
hydro object, which is not great fun in implementation. But that's what the model has.
Okay. So that would mean we have to do this complicated update as well. The problem we're having basically is that if we update that Annex 1 schema, all the other schemas that import the this hydro, what is it, base types or so, will have to be updated as well. So they're
It's probably not used because of the reference type mechanism. Okay, if we are sure nobody has used that, let's say if someone came up with an extended model, someone developed an extension of the hydro model in Inspire and used that, which would be perfectly valid.
Yes.
Then that would break.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So we have to find a solution for that. But all the other ones were pretty straightforward to do. This is really giving at least me quite a headache. So okay. The last thing that we discussed was the change of the code list encoding, and Clemens came up in the meeting with this proposal to replace the GML code type with an Inspire specific union type that basically would be a choice between using the code type or a GML reference type, and it would look like something like that.
Some heavy documentation to say not to use too many of the things in the wrong mixture, because that in XSD terms means you can just create something valid which is partially one thing and partially the other. But, so as we said, there's a risk as you loosen the schemas that it allows people to do things that at the schema level are correct but are just not right.
Well, my understanding was that we would use that only for the updated Annex 1 schemas, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
So we need to make sure that when somebody like me is writing data to that Annex 1 schema, I don't provide both a code space URI and an Xlink href on the same instance.
But you have similar cases, in schema validation.
But what would be the harm in that if it's inconsistent?
Yeah.
I mean, like they could use the old.
You could actually do both.
Yes, exactly.
That would make everybody happy.
Yeah. Create an instance that encodes it in both ways.
I mean, the only problem is if you have if one and the other is not consistent, then yeah. Okay. Okay, so the proposed process for carrying this forward would be to maybe to do some further research on the things we didn't agree upon today, and then basically use the discussion from today to turn them into a proposal, to then publish the updated schemas according to these rules on the draft schemas page, to test the updated schemas with existing Annex 1 data and software. My question is who would like to do that? How can we involve as many people as possible to make sure that what we propose work? And then basically have an endorsement of the updated schemas by the MIG. And as Wolfgang said, to do it as fast as possible. But this is basically showing the balance that we have to strike here. We have to come up with a proposal that works, that has been tested, and that is working. On the other hand, we need to do it possibly quickly, and we need to we need to communicate it with enough ahead warning so that people can actually try and adapt to that. This was off the top of my head the other day, so if you have any suggestions, ideas on how we can do this in a better way, I'm more than happy for suggestions. My main point would be, how can we get as many people as possible trying to test these things with the data that they already have used or the software that they've already developed?
It's very simple. You have to pay the people.
But I mean, you get, if you like, something
You don't have to pay us. We're happy to.
you get some people with a vested interest. So
Yeah, I think. I mean, yeah.
because we're halfway through about to publish an Inspire water hydrology network data set, it's obviously in our interest to check what impact this would have on us. So we'd certainly do it for the ones that we're close to, but we don't have a plan to publish admin units until somewhere slightly before the deadline, so we probably wouldn't. Well, I shouldn't finish the sentence with "we don't have a plan to." That wouldn't be quite. So it's not in hand, so we wouldn't. It would be harder for us to put the effort in to test admin units, whereas water and names, we test it because they're both in progress.
So I mean, I guess it's basically a call out to anybody who has already implemented or is in the process, like yourself, of implementing that to test the proposed updates. Any other ideas, thoughts? Yeah.
I would agree with the comment made earlier that earlier is better. So I think all the changes you proposed, even if some of them might cause a few little headaches in the short term, making a bigger change early is probably better than doing a bunch of little small ones. So as far as we're concerned, make all the changes you think you need to make it work sooner rather than later, and then let us know.
Okay.
But I guess the question is, changes on draft schemas or on the schemas folder? I think it's one thing to publish it in drafts fairly quickly, but what's the time? So until when do you give? When do you consider sufficient testing that it's good to go and make notes for approval? I think that's in a way the key question.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know how often there is an update to the finalized. It's not a yearly thing, is it?
No. I mean, ideally, this should be the last update for a few years at least. Well, but we want to. I mean, that's the point. I mean, we want to be sure that it's not something that we then have to correct half a year later because somebody realized it doesn't quite work, or yeah.
I'm not an expert in GML, but I don't understand why you don't publish two schemas, one for the 2010 regulation and one.
That's the proposal. I mean, the old schemas will still be there. I mean, we don't replace them, and anybody can still use them until 2017 or 2020. But we want to publish the new ones, and for those who want to use the new ones, we want to be sure that they are okay. Now I think I understood the question. You're asking why don't we publish a new schema that is not backwards compatible?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because when you produce data, you can choose whether to use the old schema.
Because I mean, ideally, I think we would like to work towards one schema that everybody uses.
Yeah, but in fact, you will need to know whether it's old data or new data, because the clients will not be the clients.
I guess the argument is that if the schemas are indeed backwards compatible, then you don't need to know. They should reflect on that.
I mean, the idea is, yeah, if your client uses the latest schema, it will always be able to handle any data coming in. I think that's the assumption. Yes.
I think part of it is also that most of the changes are not that big that we see, and it's actually questionable how much data is actually out there, because it's references to candidate types and to placeholders, which probably quite often has not been filled anyhow. So
it was actually not possible to use.
So it's actually quite creating a new namespace and invalidating everything before seems a much more drastic step than trying to make a smoother approach, which I think in most cases will not be noticed anyhow.
I think in most cases the candidate types weren't even
placeholder.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's from me, from my side, that would be it. Any other comments, questions, ideas?
Just a question. Would be nice to know a timeline, complete timeline for this.
Yeah, I agree. If you're wanting the updated schemas endorsed by the MIG, then how often does the MIG meet? Because then you can work your timeline backwards as to based on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, it comes back to the question on how much testing do we want to do, and how much do we consider to be appropriate testing. And I mean, let's say, if I was able to get, let's say, the brightest minds in this room to at least do a review of the schema changes on paper, or where they can to do it also using some existing data sets, I would be happy to publish to propose them for endorsement in the next meeting, end of September or so. But that for me, I feel that just let's say by myself, or in the small team that we have at JRC, to propose these things without having at least 4 or 6 or 10 eyes looking at it. I don't want to take that responsibility, because in the end it's a lot of very detailed technical things, and you really need to understand XML schema and GML to know that you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, well, from the audience survey's perspective, again, September would be a good time to be looking to get the schemas out there and available. And if we're involved in testing, then it means that the work that we've got ongoing at the moment with the 2 data sets that we're wanting to release fairly soon.
It means we'll release water valid against the old schema, and then at some point in the following 2 years we'll switch it to the new one. But that's fine, unless it slips again.
So is there a possibility to have some kind of small workshop around this thing? Very, very technical GML meeting.
And we're really working on the XML documents.
Yeah.
Yeah? That could be done.
Yeah, that might be on the scope of today to do that, because from our side, it would be good to have our developers look at some stuff.
Sorry? Okay.
I'm not a developer, so it would be good to get some of our XML developers to look at some of these changes.
One of the things we could do is really trying to document the proposed updates, and there is a document already that basically shows the old and the new schemas and the proposed changes, with some documentation on why and how, and then just work through the open issues that we have on such a workshop. So basically to send that out to interested developers, and then organize maybe a web full half a day or full day web conference where we just work through the issues, and then basically based on that come up with a proposal that we propose to the MIG for adoption. Will that make sense? Okay. Then anybody in the room who's interested with their organization to participate in this activity, please come to me and give me your email or give me a card after the workshop, so I can include you in the email sending out that stuff. And then please, anybody who's not yet registered in the pool of experts for Inspire, please do so we can, if anything comes up in the future about maintenance procedures and so on about GML, we can keep you in the loop. Okay? Any other questions, comments, suggestions? Yes?
Did you modify also the UML models?
No. No. That is something for future work. For me, the main thing is to really get the Annex, at least for the Annex 1, to get these schemas out. So basically, we were looking at the short-term actions here, let's say, to discuss on what we can do with the Annex 1 schemas, and then anything that is for for other aspects on the schema maintenance rules and how to get the UML models consistent with the schemas and so on. That's for later. Okay. Any other questions?
How long would it take you to actually get those schemas ready for review? And the real short term?
I mean, basically, when preparing the slides, I updated at least the document showing the schema extracts. So I think it could be done in a week or so for review for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it would be good to have that done before everybody leaves on the summer holidays. So we can try and do the workshop at the end of, well, towards the end of July, if that's still, people are still there. Okay, yeah, I mean, I think I can probably send out the updated schema proposals by the end of next week. Yeah. Because, I mean, basically they are more or less the same ones as we have discussed them at the end of last year. It's just minor things that should be changed, I think. I cannot promise that I can get my head around the hydro object, but everything else I think we can do before. Okay. Good. Thanks very much. That was quite interesting, I think. And I promised Clemens to be on time so we can go watch the Germany play Portugal. So I managed.